Man's Three Afflictions and the Business of Science. A talk by Darfree John. Let us talk about affliction. In the classical Buddhist description, Gautama contemplates existence and develops the presumption that existence is suffering. This analysis is the basis of the conception of the way in Hinayana Buddhism, in which existence is conceived as a problem to be solved through overcoming or vanishing all tendency toward association with manifestation. Yet, even if existence itself is not conceived as inherently a problem, if existence is not definable as suffering, it is still possible to observe one's existence as something that includes suffering or has the potential for suffering. When we think about the fact that life can involve suffering, we tend to think in terms of extreme difficulties: death, disease, war and famine, separation, sorrow, and all the rest. Such suffering is extreme. In other words, it is not common. Although some people in some places in the world at the present time commonly suffer these difficulties, human life in general does not involve continuous suffering at the level of extremes. But human existence, bereft of higher understanding and enlightenment, is in general afflicted. It contains the quality of suffering. That suffering may be exquisite or profound, but it is not extreme in the usual sense of being afflicted by terrible disease and disasters. If we observe our ordinary lives, apart from extreme forms of suffering, but also apart from the natural transcendence involved in full enlightenment or God communion, we can see that certain kinds of affliction are more or less constant. It is interesting to observe one's moment-to-moment existence and to see what those afflictions are. Perhaps all of them could be summarized in terms of boredom, doubt, and discomfort. We can suffer extremes, but in our moment-to-moment existence, which is generally not associated with extreme forms of suffering, we are still tending to be constantly afflicted by boredom, doubt, and discomfort. The enlightened point of view does not presume that existence is inherently qualified by suffering. Apart from enlightenment, however, existence does appear to be inherently a form of suffering because it is constantly afflicted. People are aware of the fact that they are trying to avoid extreme forms of suffering, but they are less aware of the fact that in every moment they are trying to avoid the natural or ordinary forms of suffering. They are constantly trying to avoid the subtle afflictions of boredom, doubt, and discomfort. In our profound anxiety, at the level of fear, we're trying to avoid the extreme forms of suffering. But we also maintain an ordinary level of anxiety, a kind of tension in which we are trying to avoid being overcome by the feelings of boredom, doubt, and discomfort. It is the desire to avoid these forms of ordinary affliction that produces our habits of self-indulgence. We animate ourselves constantly to avoid these three forms of affliction. So, we're always wanting to stimulate ourselves or to console ourselves, because if you sit quietly, I don't know for how long, you'll soon feel that you're bored, or there may be some discomfort that you're feeling. And then, of course, doubt arises. You start thinking even about whether your spouse loves you, or whether you're doing the right thing in life, or da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Boredom, doubt, and discomfort. These are our three main areas that we could suffer from if we didn't go out there and find stimulations and consolations. But that's not the way to live. I'll read more because you'll realize that we're actually doing boredom, doubt, and discomfort. Just like that, I'm doing the pinch. We're pinching ourselves. These afflictions aren't happening to us. We're doing them. In our profound anxiety, at the level of fear, we're trying to avoid the extreme forms of suffering, but we also maintain an ordinary level of anxiety, a kind of tension in which we're trying to avoid being overcome by the feelings of boredom, doubt, and discomfort. It is the desire to avoid these forms of ordinary affliction that produces our habits of self-indulgence. We animate ourselves constantly to avoid these three forms of affliction. Boredom is a form of suffering that we very much want to avoid, so we keep ourselves interested. We disturb ourselves with interest to avoid boredom. We console ourselves with beliefs to avoid doubt, and we indulge ourselves physically in food and sex and drink and drugs and so forth to avoid discomfort. Independent of realized understanding, people live in fear of extreme suffering and maintain a level of anxiety or tension developed through the form of self-indulgent habits to avoid the ordinary forms of suffering. In other words, people live as if existence were inherently a form of suffering. Self-indulgence in its various forms is a primary method that ordinary people, the unenlightened ones, use to escape these afflictions. But religious preoccupation in the conventional form, the believing in Jesus kind of mechanism, is another method ordinary people apply in their anxiety to avoid the basic discomfort of existence. So when you are in my presence, when you greet me in the morning, you're expecting me to reply. You're expecting me to do something in order, you didn't realize this, but in order to alleviate you of boredom, doubt, or discomfort. It's a strategy that this is about. It's a mechanism that this is about. It's at the root, we call it the self-contraction. It's not necessary. And then, if we stop doing this self-contraction, we will be happy and in love at all times. We will be living as God expects us to. So stop doing the self-contraction that is at the root of boredom, doubt, and discomfort. I'll just read this last paragraph once more. Boredom, well, actually there's 4, 5, or 6 or 7 more pages of this essay, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of it. Boredom is a form of suffering that we very much want to avoid. So we think these are natural human states, to be bored, to be doubtful, to be, feel discomfort, and then we blame others for this, that, and the other. But it's not natural. It really is not natural to be bored, to be doubting all the time, and to look for self-indulgence because of our feelings of discomfort. It's not natural. It's not nice. It's not good. It's immature, childish, and adolescent. Believe me, it is. Find this out for yourselves. So, once again, boredom is a form of suffering that we very much want to avoid. So we keep ourselves interested. We disturb ourselves with interest to avoid boredom. We console ourselves with beliefs to avoid doubt. And we indulge ourselves physically in food, sex, drink, drugs, and so forth to avoid discomfort. Independent of realized understanding, people live in fear of extreme suffering and maintain a level of anxiety or tension, developed through the form of self-indulgent habits to avoid the ordinary forms of suffering. In other words, people live as if existence were inherently a form of suffering. Everyone is running around like headless chickens, looking for others and things to make them happy. So we've got to change our way of living. We've got to commune with God. We've got to become already happy. So find your bridge. Find your divine person. Find your mouthpiece to re-educate you and take up a life of true spiritual practice, which is divine communion, moment to moment to moment.